Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing okay, doing well. My name is Matthew, and recently I began to think, what do Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Kamala Harris all share in common? Well, to begin answering that question, we have to look at the man, the myth, the legend, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. A mouthful. Born in 1770 and living until 1831, he was a German philosopher who created a new philosophical method for analyzing how opposing ideas clash in history. This method is now known to us as Hegelian dialectics. The dialectics have three main components: the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. The thesis is an idea or assertion that is held. The antithesis is its opposite, that directly clashes with the thesis. The resulting conflict between the thesis and the antithesis inevitably comes and resolves into what's called a synthesis. The synthesis is a combination of the two ideas that result in the middle ground, taking positive elements from both but also keeping some negative elements as well. Hegelian dialectics are actually still used today to analyze politics, economics, music, and history, which is where we're going to be looking today. The music that I've used today as well highlights what Hegel is talking about, the ideal freedom. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If you didn't understand any of that, I don't blame you. It's a pretty tricky business that took me, honestly, a while to understand. But the easiest way I found to understand it, which might help you, is, okay, let's say you have the color red. You're the person on the left. Your palette and paintbrush only has this nice little red hue. Now this color usually stands for anger, and has this nice sort of passionate element to it. This will be our thesis. Well, let's say your buddy has the color blue only on their palette. This usually stands for calmness, tranquility. This would be the antithesis. Naturally though, you both get into an argument about which color is the best. Well, I only have red, so red is superior to your blue. Well, your friend's probably going to think, well, my blue is superior. I like my blue better than your red, because at least I'm not angry. I have a nice calm color and hue. Well, you start arguing, you keep on talking about which color is the best. But eventually, the red and blue accidentally get mixed together. They form purple. The purple takes both elements from red and blue, but it makes a unique and different substance altogether. It keeps the passion of red, but also has the calmness and tranquility of blue. They all mix together to form this unique new substance, purple. Can blue or red illustrate what purple can alone? No. This new color is our synthesis of the two conflicting ideas, the thesis of red and the antithesis of blue. Much the same, history can be analyzed through the lens of conflicting ideas and their sometimes random resolutions. Hegel believed that history's conflicts all lead us to the goal of being more rational. Hegel believed freedom is a result of human rationality. The more free a society is, the more rational it is. So he believed that all conflicts throughout history had the express goal of leading us to more and more freedom. If every new synthesis then becomes a new thesis, it begins the process again, and its rationality is always challenged. Hegel believed this process leads to an unfolding of the world spirit, or Weltgeist. Don't worry, that's not on the quiz. The Weltgeist, or the world spirit, is humans' need for greater self-awareness and freedom. Like college, though, this process for greater self-awareness, freedom, and maybe rationality is not always great, though. History, like college, is often very messy, and it sometimes takes a few steps back to take that one giant leap ahead. However, Hegel always believed that eventually humanity will get to the end of history, in quotations, where freedom, rationality, and self-awareness are absolute values in society. But Hegel believed it's more interesting to look at what we're doing now and in the past, to how we get to that end. because I guess it's a little bit more fun to look at people failing than do good, I guess. And that's where the music comes in play. I present the Baroque and classical period of music for Thomas Jefferson, more romantic period music when we talk about Abraham Lincoln, and finally we have a more modern jazz sort of approach to Kamala. Because in a way, music, like history, is constantly evolving. There's more freedom and more input of people's voices. We can see how it turned from a very structured European sort of style to now a more free and more collective sort of voice that allows African Americans and everyone to express themselves musically. Now, Hegel's idea of rationalism and freedom actually can be seen in the Enlightenment period of philosophy, one that inspired our founding fathers. One such name, who needs no introduction, is Thomas Jefferson. He was born in 1743 and lived until 1826. And he's the main author of the Declaration of Independence. Not the Constitution, the Declaration. Where he wrote the powerful line, "All men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Thomas Jefferson and the revolutionary men and women who fought against Great Britain were the antithesis to Britain's political philosophies. However, there were similarities between the two. Again, with the color reference, right? We do have some similarities, but we also have some differences. For instance, the English Bill of Rights, written in 1689, was a pivotal document that inspired the Founding Fathers. It actually limited the power of the king, and it outlined individual rights that all Englishmen possess, in which it created a constitutional monarchy that a parliament oversaw. Yet America was increasingly being controlled and usurped by the Parliament of England. Taxation without representation was the name of the game. Americans were seen as second-class citizens of Britain, expected to provide wealth, trade, and soldiers to the crown. Yet they were unable to enjoy the fruits of prosperity that they sent to the mother country. And thus, we saw a clash on the battlefield. Enlightenment principles were to be the backbone of the colonists' war. They fought for an abolishment of monarchy, a representative Republican government, separation of church and state, free speech, and a fair judicial system. During the war, as outlined here, they passed the zenith of their antithetical thought, the Articles of Confederation. Thus we have the thesis, the parliamentary government of England, the constitutional monarchy. Then we have its antithesis, the revolutionary men and women and the Articles of Confederation. But you might be asking, cool, but what is the synthesis of all this? What did we win by battling Great Britain, if it's not the Articles of Confederation, our victory? Well, the synthesis was actually the Constitution, created in 1787. This was to be the synthesis. The Constitution combined common political elements of Great Britain and the Articles of Confederation in Enlightenment philosophy that create a unique and better system of government than both alone. The Constitution empowered the executive branch of the government to be independent, but it was held under checks and balances of the legislative and judicial branches of government. This was a combination of the too strong executive branch, the monarchy of Great Britain, and the too weak executive branch of the Articles of Confederation. Actually, there wasn't an executive branch in the Articles of Confederation. The monarch of Great Britain, for instance, could declare war and peace without approval of the Parliament. But the Articles of the Confederation, on the other hand, had no executive or judicial branch. All policies had to be approved by the Congress, with approval from all 13 states. Also, too, that includes declaring war and peace. Now, imagine this, right? You have to get 13 politicians from 13 states to approve something. I don't think you could do that. Because in reality, you can't even get politicians to agree on what they want to have for lunch, right? But also, on the other end of the spectrum, a tyrant king can just declare war on whoever he wants and ignore the common people's wishes. The Constitution created these checks and balances that made sure the people's will was heard, but also that it wasn't so extreme where everyone had to agree on something. Now we just need a constitutional majority. And now, Thomas Jefferson, in his State of the Union speech in 1801, explains how this new synthesis works for Americans that were under attack in Tripoli and the Barbary States. He exclaims in this speech, "Unauthorized by the Constitution, without the sanction of Congress to go beyond the line of defense, the vessel, being disabled from committing further hostilities, was liberated with its crew." He then hopes that the legislature will doubtless consider whether, by authorizing measures of offense also, they will place our force on equal footing with that of its adversaries. And he implores the legislature to exercise this important function of declaring war on Tripoli and the Barbary States. In this capacity, the Constitution allows the representative body of the legislature, the Congress, to express the people's will in terms of foreign policy. And it's up to the executive branch, though, to dictate and direct those war efforts. So what we see is we have both positives from the thesis and antithesis now in this synthesis of the Constitution. Because think, it avoids the tyranny of a monarch just freely deciding when and when he cannot go and declare war on other people. But also, it keeps the people's will that was in the Articles of Confederation, but streamlines it, so it's easier and more comprehensive and better. The Constitution is a great document that, again, provide a more coherent form of government and stronger political philosophy. Yet, as with all syntheses, there are flaws. Thomas Jefferson was dissatisfied with a pervasive and centralized government. Rather, he pushed for a decentralized agrarian state. He might be more in favor of the Articles of Confederation. As he states in his State of the Union speech in 1801 again, "Among those who are dependent on the executive discretion, I begun the reduction of what was deemed unnecessary." In a sense, he cut a lot of the executive responsibilities, a lot of offices, a lot of state government bodies, he cut because he wanted to see a smaller government. He was careful to not let the government consume the whole residue of what it was instituted to guard, which sounds amazing. I wish we still spoke like that. But essentially, what he's saying is he doesn't want government to be so big that it consumes everything, like we saw with the Great Britain monarchy. He didn't want to see that. He wanted to see states have more power than the federal government. He wanted more a decentralized government, maybe more akin to the Articles of Confederation. But Jefferson had big flaws with that, because again, with every synthesis, it evolves to a new thesis that's to be challenged. And what this caused is that he implored a revisal of the laws on the subject of naturalization, saying that it is too great a denial to others who come finding asylum from around the world in his State of the Union speech. But that revision only looked towards Western European asylum seekers. We only looked to the English, Anglo-Saxon, and Scottish immigrants. We didn't look to other areas of Europe like Germany, Ireland, France, Spain. We didn't look to those people. He contradicted himself in that all men are created equal clause that he wrote in the Declaration. And the biggest thing that he neglected is the pervasive issue of slavery. This is something that the synthesis kept from both slavery. Slavery was both in Great Britain and in the Articles of Confederation in the Revolutionary Movement. And these differing ideas of how powerful and centralized the government should be would inevitably see this new thesis come into conflict with its antithesis. This new antithesis would be led by abolitionists and Republicans. such as Abraham Lincoln, who called for a stronger national government, a more centralized government that can exact policy onto the states to ban this immoral practice of slavery. This thesis now that Jefferson represents, that came from the synthesis, this would stand actually until 1861, uncontested on the battlefield, or even, I suppose, out loud. The issue of slavery, overreaching in government, and the problem of immigration would now come to a head. So now, let's go into 1861 in our time machine. So now we have two new ideas. We have the thesis, represented by the Democratic Party leader, John C. Breckinridge, and we have the antithesis, Abraham Lincoln. The industrialized North that Lincoln represented was comprised of free African Americans, Germans, Irish, Anglo-Saxons, and many other immigrants. But the South contained a sort of caste system, with Anglo-Saxons in the planter class, the rich, plantation owner, the wealthy people, with immigrants that didn't come from Britain slightly above African American slaves. It was a caste system, and they didn't like to see all these new influx of immigrants not from England. Now, that's not to say the North was some utilitarian utopia that gave everyone freedom, the same rights, but they were very much different than the South. Thus, we arrive to our next Hegelian dialectic conflict. The North, representing the antithesis, saw many states pass laws that allowed non-land-owning white men the chance to vote. They called for a stronger federal government and believed slavery fundamentally should be abolished because it is a moral question. The South, though, represented the thesis, a continuation of the dominance of the aristocratic Anglo-Saxon class, who had mainly founded this country, and believed slavery was a matter of state discretion. They called for a weaker federal government and an emphasis on agrarianism, much like Thomas Jefferson believed. These ideas took time to boil into physical conflict, though. The North and South took 74 years before the Civil War actually occurred. Along the way, though, many contradictions and developments took place, questioning the Founding Fathers further, and they entrenched both sides further away from each other. However, both sides, like any Hegelian conflict, believed that they were more in alignment with the Founding Fathers' vision, and that they were the correct side. Now, the issue of slavery, mainly, was akin to the crimson hand from Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. As he writes, "The birthmark expressed the ineludible gripe in which mortality clutches the highest and purest of earthly mold, degrading them into kindred with the lowest and even with the very brutes." What he's saying essentially, with the birthmark, is that the woman in the story, such a beautiful creature she was, that birthmark tarnished her down to the level of even brutes, and from the perspective of the protagonist. And slavery was the same thing. So noble an ambition was it to have a nation that was free, that accepted all asylum seekers, and sought liberty and the pursuit of happiness for all. But slavery, like the birthmark, degraded us to brutes, to savages. It's notable. Britain actually abolished slavery in the 1830s, but yet in the 1860s, we were one of the only few countries of European founding that still had this practice. Further on, he writes that this one defect grew more and more intolerable with every moment. As the birthmark, slavery too grew more and more intolerable with this fragile young republic. It was this contradictory nature of the thesis and morality that was to accelerate conflict with its antithesis. The most influential figure of this antithesis was to be Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, born 1809 and living until 1865, stood as a pragmatic abolitionist who tried to avoid solving this dialectical conflict away from the battleground, but unfortunately he was not able to do that. He was elected president in 1861, and with that news, many states of the South started to break from the Union. And eventually, the Battle of Fort Sumter in April 1861 was to be the spark that flamed the Civil War. Now, Lincoln before stated in his House Divide speech in 1858 that the Union cannot stand divided. It cannot continue to be permanently half slave and half free. And Lincoln directly challenges the thesis of slavery, the old order, and decentralized government by saying quite emphatically that we need to meet and overthrow the power of that dynasty. It's the work now before all those who will prevent that consummation of slavery. Like Jefferson, Lincoln challenges the thesis of despotism, immorality, and tyranny directly. Yet Lincoln now stands as the antithesis to Jefferson's insistence on states' rights and a decentralized federal government, and sort of an ambiguousness when it comes to the matter of slavery. As we see, Lincoln believed the Constitution remains an open question according to the speech he gave when it comes to powers of the state, and that one side will either enforce slavery or another will force abolition by the Supreme Court. So he believes that the thesis will do what they want to do, and so we might as well do what we want to do. Just get rid of slavery. But how do we do that? Again, what we see is Thomas Jefferson saying, we need a smaller, less centralized government. But Lincoln, on the other hand, is like, dude, no. We need a larger centralized government so that we can enact policy and actually see this changed. And so now we find ourselves on the battlefield again. Much like the revolutionary men and women, like Jefferson versus the monarch and parliament of Great Britain. We see now it goes on the battleground. Because, as Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We need one thing, or we need all the other thing. And so, that led to the conclusion of the Civil War, the new synthesis. You might be asking, how exactly does winning the Civil War change anything, right? Lincoln won, right? Like he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We need to have a total abolishment of slavery, which, yes, he accomplished with the Emancipation Proclamation, but also we kept old things as well. Because Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in America. He also promised the Homesteading Act that saw immigrants from all across walks of life in Europe able to come to America and successfully find plots of land and find success. But we still kept some of that old Southern order. Again, we kept Jim Crow laws. We kept discrimination against women. We saw some of the old order still with us. We saw lynching. We saw many ugly things that the synthesis now kept. And like Prince Prospero from the Masquerade of the Red Death, those in power shielded themselves and their version of the Abbey away from the devastation, discrimination, and suffering that these laws now passed. Because like with the thesis and antithesis, we now have the main clash with states' rights for Jim Crow and the states' rights not to have Jim Crow. Again, we're to find ourselves in another battle for a thesis and an antithesis. Poe writes about the Red Death that no pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Much the same way, Jim Crow laws, discrimination, lynching, all these things were so hideous and tarnished the image of freedom and liberty that America was supposed to stand for. And in a way, as I stated, it paved the way for further conflict. But it's notable, along the way, every new synthesis, every new conflict led us closer and closer to more equal opportunity, freedom, self-awareness, rationality, as we see here in this picture. Only about 100 years it took, but it finally got to it, that Martin Luther King Jr. and many civil rights leaders actually pushed successfully for the Civil Rights Act. Now, with that being said, we have all our previous Hegelian conflicts. We see how Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson were different, but yet sort of the same, with their antithetical thought, with their push for more liberty, for more freedom. Now, how does that correlate to recent times? Well, let's go back in our time machine to 2024. Kamala Harris has now just lost to Donald Trump after an intense election cycle. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, are heavily entrenched in their choice of candidate, believing themselves to be correct, more in line with the Constitution and the vision of the Founding Fathers. Which, again, with Hegelian dialectics, this makes sense, right? Because all people in this conflict believe they're right. Things appear as polarized as ever, though. They are now. But that doesn't really hold true if we look at it from a Hegelian dialectical fashion. Maybe we have more things to argue about now. But again, this thesis and antithesis will constantly clash. We're not polarized. We are in another conflict of Hegelian dialectics, which again will ultimately see more freedom, more rationality, more self-awareness than before. It's not as bad as it seems to those who are sad about the election results, but to those who are happy as well, we need to keep in mind that again, we're constantly evolving to have more and more freedom. That Donald Trump is another step along the way to this path of more rationality. And Kamala Harris, though, does stand for all these syntheses that have evolved throughout history, American history. Because you have to think, not making this political, but Kamala Harris running would be unthinkable in Lincoln's time. A woman of color running for president of America? You gotta be kidding me. Even 50 years ago, though, with the civil rights movement, that still would be unthinkable that a woman of color could actually almost win. Kamala Harris, in her closing argument speech in 2024, states that across the generations, Americans have preserved that freedom and have constantly expanded it. What she's saying essentially is what I've been saying all along. That's these syntheses of American history that propel us forward, sometimes back, but they all lead us eventually forward. Now, she outlines in her closing argument speech that she wants a larger, more centralized government. She wants to reform immigration, which these are all in line with what Abraham Lincoln said, and directly opposed, though, to what Thomas Jefferson said. Because, funnily enough, Donald Trump maybe represents more of what Thomas Jefferson envisioned for him with the thesis. And yet, though, she also wants to make larger welfare and economic benefits for citizens, legalize abortion, implement gun control, and many more elements of change that Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln didn't outline that they want to see done. Again, though, this comes to the process that we have more to talk about and more to conflict against in this generation. And unlike Jefferson, though, she wants to see this expansion and centralization of the government. Yet, her implications are different than Lincoln's industrialism, or even Jefferson's agrarianism. Like Lincoln, though, she wants to supersede states' rights and indicate more of a coherent, centralized policy for moral issues, such as reproductive rights. such as gun control. But as it was the abolishment of slavery for Lincoln, Kamala in her speech indicates that the abolishment of abortion bans is of utmost importance, that individuals' medical rights and autonomy is of utmost priority, and she wants to see an end to gun violence, much like Lincoln. Like Jefferson and Lincoln, she stands as a new antithesis to thought, because all of them, whether or not they agree on a larger, more centralized government, and obviously Lincoln and Jefferson probably didn't agree with her on reproductive rights, but still, they have a lot in common based that they are both the antithesis to that thought, to these conflicts. And Donald Trump, on the other hand, stands more as a thesis, a continuation of how things are or were at one time. He wants to see immigration cut down. He wants to have more decentralized government, where states' rights are more powerful. He wants to get away with this massive centralization of government. But again, this is not political. I have no side in this race at all. But I just want to point out, though, that we sort of see the same thing happening across history with Lincoln and Jefferson with Kamala, which sort of, in a way, makes them all kind of the same force in history, a force for change. But what does this mean for the synthesis, right? Well, we saw the Constitution was the synthesis for the revolutionaries. We saw the new Union was the synthesis for after the Civil War. So, again, this new synthesis by Donald Trump and leaders of the Republican Party will keep elements, though, from both. It's not only the Republican Party. Again, we have so much more time to us before we actually get to Hegel's end of history, as he calls it, right? But this new synthesis will see a new America. We'll constantly see that we're moving towards more and more freedom, rationality, and self-awareness. We see positive elements from both sides come into play with the future coming to us. We'll see the Democratic Party policies, we'll see the Republican policies, all propelling us forward to that light at the end of the tunnel, as he says, that synthesis, if you will. As with Jefferson and Lincoln, Kamala's conflict against Trump represents a dialectical process that will see change and evolution. Yet, one thing about it, with all this mumbo-jumbo of Hegelian dialectics, all these things, the one thing that's most important, though, that he outlines is that regardless of what political aisle that you align with, sometimes you have to take a step back so that you can jump farther. Sometimes the synthesis will have negative elements. Sometimes it will have contradictions. But ultimately, we are moving as a people closer and closer to more freedom and rationality. And that is the light in the tunnel. Thank you for listening.